The spotlight hit Frank Sinatra as he stood center stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, January 1960. The room was packed with 2,000 people who'd paid top dollar to see the greatest entertainer in the world perform. The orchestra began the opening notes of One for My Baby, a slow, melancholic ballad that Frank sang better than anyone alive. This was supposed to be a moment of pure artistry, intimate, controlled, perfect. Frank closed his eyes and began to sing. His voice filled the Copa room, smooth and aching with emotion. The audience sat in reverent silence. This was why they'd come, to hear Frank Sinatra at his absolute best. And then Dean Martin stumbled onto the stage. He wasn't supposed to be there. The show notes were clear. During Frank's ballad, the stage belonged to Frank alone, but there was Dean, walking on like he'd just woken up from a nap, his tie loose, his hair slightly mussed, carrying a glass of what looked like scotch. He squinted at the audience as if he was surprised to find them there. Then he looked at Frank, who had stopped singing mid-phrase, and Dean said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, were you singing? My bad, Pally." The audience didn't know what to do. Was this part of the show? The orchestra had stopped playing. Frank stood frozen at the microphone, staring at Dean with an expression that could have been fury or shock or both. 2,000 people held their breath, waiting to see what Frank Sinatra would do. And then something happened that no one expected. Frank's face cracked, his lips twitched, and Frank Sinatra started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, a real deep, uncontrollable laugh. The kind of laugh that doubles you over. Frank tried to sing the next line and couldn't get through it because he was laughing too hard. Dean just stood there, grinning, taking a sip of his drink, and the audience, released from their tension, erupted in applause and laughter. That was the night the Rat Pack was truly born, not as a planned act, not as a carefully orchestrated performance, but as something spontaneous and wild and completely unpredictable. It was the night Frank Sinatra learned that sometimes the best performances are the ones you don't plan. And it was the night that three men, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr., discovered that their friendship could become something the entertainment world had never seen before. But to understand that night, you need to understand these men, who they were, where they came from, and why that moment of chaos on stage meant so much more than just a good laugh. Frank Sinatra was a man who lived and breathed control. By 1960, he was at the absolute peak of his career. He'd won an Oscar. His albums were selling millions. He owned a piece of the Sands Hotel. He was, without question, the most powerful entertainer in America. But Frank's need for control didn't come from arrogance. It came from fear. The fear of losing everything again. In 1952, Frank's career had collapsed. His voice gave out. His movie studio dropped him. His marriage fell apart. He went from being the biggest star in America to a has-been in less than 2 years. Frank clawed his way back through sheer determination and talent, winning the Oscar for From Here to Eternity in 1954 and rebuilding his career brick by brick, but the experience left scars. Frank became obsessed with controlling every aspect of his performances. Every note had to be perfect. Every show had to be planned down to the second, because if Frank controlled everything, nothing could go wrong. Nothing could be taken from him again. Dean Martin was the opposite. Dean had learned early in life that you couldn't control anything, so why try? He was born Dino Paul Corsetti in Steubenville, Ohio, in 1917, the son of an Italian immigrant barber. Dean grew up poor, dropped out of school in the 10th grade, worked in a steel mill, dealt blackjack in illegal gambling houses. He took punches as a boxer just to earn a few dollars. Life had taught Dean that plans were worthless. Things happened. You rolled with them. By the late 1950s, Dean had broken free from his partnership with Jerry Lewis, a split that everyone in Hollywood said would destroy Dean's career. Jerry was the genius, they said. Dean was just the handsome sidekick, but Dean proved them wrong. He launched a solo career that made him a bigger star than he'd ever been with Jerry. Hit records, hit movies, his own television show, and Dean did it all while looking like he didn't care. That was Dean's secret. He made success look effortless because he refused to take any of it too seriously. When Frank and Dean first met in the late 1940s, they were acquaintances, nothing more. They'd nod to each other at parties, exchange pleasantries, but there was a distance. Frank was intense, driven, always working an angle. Dean was laid back, cool, seemingly indifferent to the hustle. They were too different. That changed in 1959 on the set of a Western called Rio Bravo. Dean had been cast as Dude, an alcoholic deputy trying to redeem himself. It was a serious, dramatic role, and Frank, who wasn't in the film but visited the set, was curious to see how Dean would handle it. What Frank saw surprised him. Dean was a natural actor. He brought depth and vulnerability to Dude that went beyond anything Frank had expected. Dean made it look easy, but Frank could see the craft underneath, the intelligence, the emotional honesty. After watching Dean work, Frank pulled him aside. "You're good at this." Dean shrugged. "It's just acting, Frank. It's not brain surgery." "No, I mean it. You're really good." Dean looked at Frank and saw something he hadn't expected. Respect. Real respect. Not the Hollywood kind where people said nice things because it was polite, but genuine admiration from someone who understood the work. "Thanks, Pally," Dean said. And something shifted between them, a recognition that despite their differences, maybe even because of their differences, they understood each other. Over the next year, Frank and Dean started spending more time together. Frank was drawn to Dean's ease, the way Dean could walk into any situation and make it feel relaxed. Dean was drawn to Frank's intensity, the passion Frank brought to everything he did. They balanced each other. Where Frank pushed, Dean pulled back. Where Dean drifted, Frank focused. And somehow, it worked. But there was a third piece to this puzzle. A young entertainer named Sammy Davis Jr., who was about to change everything. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most talented performers in America, and almost nobody knew it. He could sing, dance, do impressions, play instruments, act. He was a one-man variety show. But in 1959, Sammy faced a problem that had nothing to do with talent. He was black. And in Las Vegas, in the hotels and casinos that lined the Strip, that meant Sammy could perform on stage but couldn't stay in the hotels. He couldn't eat in the restaurants. He had to enter through the back doors, the service entrances. After performing for white audiences who screamed and applauded, Sammy would have to leave the building and find a room in the segregated part of town. Frank Sinatra had seen Sammy perform at a small club in Los Angeles in 1958. He'd been blown away. Sammy had an energy, a charisma, a pure joy in performing that Frank recognized immediately. After the show, Frank went backstage. "Kid, you're incredible." Sammy, who idolized Frank, could barely speak. "Thank you, Mr. Sinatra. That means everything. Call me Frank. And I want you to come perform with me sometime. Vegas, the Sands." Sammy's eyes widened. The Sands was the top venue in Vegas. But Sammy also knew what that meant. "Frank, I appreciate it, but you know I can't stay there." "The hotels don't—" "They will," Frank interrupted. "When you're performing with me, you'll stay where I stay. You'll eat where I eat. Anyone has a problem with that. They can talk to me." Frank wasn't naive. He knew the fight he was picking. Las Vegas in 1959 was deeply segregated, but Frank didn't care. Sammy was talented, and Frank believed that talent should be respected regardless of skin color. More than that, Frank had grown up Italian in a time when Italians were discriminated against, called names, treated as less than. He understood what it felt like to be on the outside, and he'd made a decision a long time ago that if he ever had power, he'd use it to open doors for people who deserved to walk through them. The night Sammy arrived, Frank personally walked him through the front entrance of the Sands, past the startled looks of guests and staff, right up to the front desk. "This is Sammy Davis Jr., Frank said to the desk clerk. "He's performing with me this week. Give him a suite." The clerk, flustered, stammered, "Of course, Mr. Sinatra." Sammy felt something he'd never felt before in Las Vegas. Dignity, respect, the sense that he belonged. That night, Sammy performed with Frank for the first time. He was nervous. This was Frank Sinatra, the biggest star in the world. Sammy didn't want to make a mistake. He came on stage and sang, danced, did everything perfectly, too perfectly. He was so focused on being good that he forgot to be himself. After the show, Frank pulled Sammy aside. "You were great, but you were tight. Relax. You're with us now. You don't have to prove anything." "I just want to be good enough," Sammy said. "Sammy, you're better than good enough. You're one of the best I've ever seen, so stop trying to impress anyone and just do what you do." Sammy took that advice to heart. Over the next few weeks, performing alongside Frank and sometimes Dean, Sammy started to relax, started to let his personality come through, started to feel like he was part of something. By early 1960, Frank, Dean, and Sammy were performing together regularly at the Sands. They didn't have a name for what they were doing. It was just three friends on stage, singing, joking, having a good time. But audiences loved it. There was a chemistry between these three men that was electric. Frank's intensity, Dean's coolness, Sammy's boundless energy. Together they created something that felt spontaneous and real. But Frank was still controlling the shows. He'd plan out the set list, the order of songs, who would sing what and when. Everything was scripted. And Dean was getting restless. Dean had spent 10 years with Jerry Lewis performing scripted comedy routines. He was done with scripts. He wanted to be free, to improvise, to let the moment dictate what happened. And Dean had been watching the audiences during these shows with Frank and Sammy. The biggest laughs, the loudest applause, didn't come during the planned bits. They came during the unplanned moments, when someone made a joke off the cuff, when they started riffing on each other. That's when the magic happened. Dean tried to tell Frank this. "You're planning too much, Frank. Just let it happen." But Frank resisted. "People pay good money for these shows. We owe them quality. That means preparation. We can give them quality and spontaneity," Dean said. "Trust me." Frank wasn't ready to trust that. Not yet. Then came the night of January 20th, 2020, 1960. Frank was scheduled to perform at the Copa Room at the Sands. Dean and Sammy were supposed to perform earlier in the evening, separate from Frank's show. Frank's set was going to be a serious, intimate performance. Ballads, standards, the kind of show that showcased Frank's artistry. Frank arrived at the Sands that evening, in a good mood. The shows had been selling out. The audiences loved what they were doing. Everything was going according to plan. He met with the orchestra, went over the arrangements, made sure every detail was perfect. Then he went to his dressing room to prepare. Dean showed up at Frank's dressing room about an hour before showtime. He had a drink in his hand, as usual. "Big night, Pally." "Yeah, I'm doing a few new arrangements. I think people will like them." Dean smiled. "You know what people would really like? If you loosened up a little. Had some fun with it." "Dean, this is a ballad set. It's supposed to be serious." "Frank, everything's serious with you. When's the last time you just went out there and winged it?" "I don't wing it, Dean. I'm a professional." Dean shrugged. "Suit yourself." But there was a glint in his eye that Frank didn't quite catch. Frank went on stage at 10 o'clock. The room was packed. He could see familiar faces in the audience, high rollers, celebrities, people who'd come specifically to see him. The lights dimmed. The orchestra began, and Frank started singing "I've Got the World on a String." The crowd loved it. Applause filled the room. Frank moved through his set with precision. Each song flowed into the next exactly as planned. By the fourth song, "One for My Baby," Frank was in the zone. This was one of his signature songs, a melancholic meditation on loneliness and loss. The room went quiet. This was the moment people came for. Frank Sinatra, alone at the microphone, pouring his soul into a song. Frank closed his eyes and let the lyrics wash over him. "It's 2:45. There's no one in the place except you and me." And that's when Dean Martin walked onto the stage. Frank's eyes snapped open. The orchestra kept playing, but barely. Dean was walking toward Frank like he'd just wandered in from the bar. His tie was loosened. His jacket was slung over his shoulder. He carried a glass of what looked like scotch, and he had the expression of a man who'd completely forgotten where he was supposed to be. Frank stopped singing. The orchestra faltered and went silent. The entire room froze. 2,000 people stared at the stage, trying to figure out what was happening. Dean looked at Frank. Then he looked at the audience. Then back at Frank. And he said, completely deadpan, "Oh, were you singing? My bad, Pally." For a moment, nothing happened. Frank stood at the microphone, his face unreadable. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. Dean took a sip of his drink and waited. And then Frank's face began to change. His lips twitched, his eyes started to crinkle, and despite himself, despite every instinct that told him to maintain control, Frank started to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, but it grew. Frank tried to cover his mouth, tried to stop, but he couldn't. Dean's timing had been perfect. The absurdity of the interruption, the way Dean had played it completely straight, the fact that Dean had just ruined Frank's most serious moment and didn't seem to care at all, it was too much. Frank doubled over laughing. The audience, seeing Frank laugh, erupted. Applause, laughter, whistles. They loved it. This wasn't the polished, controlled performance they'd expected. This was real. This was Frank Sinatra, the biggest star in the world, losing control and loving it. Dean walked over to Frank and put his arm around him. "You okay there, Polly? You seem a little wound up." Frank, still laughing, could barely speak. "You're killing me, Dean." "Somebody had to. You were getting way too serious." From the wings, Sammy Davis Jr. had been watching. He'd seen Dean. Sammy ran onto the stage. He didn't ask permission. He just went. And when he got there, he started tap dancing around Frank and Dean, spinning, leaping, making up the choreography as he went. The orchestra, confused but professional, started playing again, picking up the tempo. Frank looked at Sammy, then at Dean, then at the audience going absolutely wild, and he realized something. Dean was right. This chaos, this spontaneity, this complete lack of control, it was better than anything Frank had planned. It was alive. It was real. It was fun. Frank grabbed the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I was going to sing you a sad song, but these two lunatics just ruined it. So instead, how about we give you a show?" The audience roared their approval. What happened for the next hour became the stuff of legend. Frank, Dean, and Sammy took over the stage and just played. They sang songs, interrupted each other, made jokes, told stories. Dean did an impression of Frank being angry that was so accurate Frank couldn't stop laughing. Sammy did impressions of both of them. Frank pretended to fire them both, and then brought them back. The orchestra tried to keep up, sometimes succeeding, sometimes just watching in amazement. Backstage after the show, Frank's manager, Hank Sanacola, was furious. "Frank, what was that? That wasn't the show we planned. That was chaos." Frank was still buzzing with adrenaline. "Yeah, it was chaos, and it was the best show I've done in years. But, Hank, did you hear that audience? They loved it. And you know what? So did I." Dean walked over, still carrying his drink. "So, you mad at me, Polly?" Frank looked at Dean for a long moment, then he grinned. "I should be. You ruined my ballad. I made it better." "Yeah," Frank said, "you did." From that night on, the shows at the Sands changed. Frank stopped trying to control everything. He let Dean and Sammy do their thing. He let the moments happen. Sometimes the shows were brilliant. Sometimes they were messy. But they were always real. And audiences couldn't get enough. The press started calling them the Rat Pack, a name they initially hated but eventually embraced. Frank was the leader, the chairman of the board. Dean was the cool one, the guy who never seemed to break a sweat. Sammy was the energy, the talent that couldn't be contained. Together, they became the biggest entertainment phenomenon of the 1960s. Years later, Dean was asked about that night in January 1960. Dean smiled. "I planned to have a drink and see what happened. That's about it. But you knew Frank might get angry." "Sure, but I also knew Frank needed to lighten up. He was so wound up trying to make everything perfect that he forgot why we do this. We do it because it's fun." And that night I reminded him. The Rat Pack would go on to define an era. They'd perform for presidents, fill casinos, make classic films like Ocean's 11, but those who were there at the Sands in the early days said those were the best shows before it became a brand. When it was just three guys who loved performing and loved each other. Sammy Davis Jr. later reflected on that period of his life and called it the happiest time he'd ever known. "I was accepted," he said. "Not just tolerated, accepted. Frank and Dean treated me like a brother. On that stage, nobody cared what color I was. They just cared that I showed up and gave everything I had. And I did, every night." The night the Rat Pack was born wasn't about planning or precision. It was about trust. Three men trusting each other enough to take risks, to be vulnerable, to let the moment unfold without knowing where it would go. And in doing so, they created something that transcended entertainment. They created a family. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr., the Rat Pack. They weren't just entertainers. They were a revolution in how people thought about performance, about friendship, about what was possible when you stopped trying to control everything and just let life happen. And it all started because Dean Martin walked onto a stage when he wasn't supposed to, interrupted Frank Sinatra's most serious song, and made the chairman of the board laugh so hard he couldn't breathe. The Rat Pack would perform together for years. They'd have triumphs and failures, moments of brilliance and moments of conflict, but they'd always have that night, the night it all began, the night three men discovered that together they could do something none of them could do alone. They could make magic.